This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, welcome back for this afternoon session. It's been great so far, and we have three more speakers who will be presenting their work this afternoon, starting with Mike Martin, Professor of Philosophy at UCL and University of California, Berkeley. We'll be talking today about the puzzling priorities of photography.
Thanks, Edie. Okay, so this is not the priority that I'm actually going to be talking about. But this relates to something that Colin and Patrick were disagreeing about yesterday. So this is a tourist photographing Rembrandt's The Night Watch, and this is another tourist photographing the Jan Steen in the same room. And notice if you go to art galleries at the moment, particularly as popular as, for instance, the Rijksmuseum, you'll find that the tourists stop in front of a painting just long enough to take a photograph of it with their iPhone or their DSLR. And they may, on occasion, photograph the caption next to it, but mainly they're just photographing the painting, and they're rather annoyed if you stand in front of the painting trying to look at it. They're not interested. And, at first sight you might think this is puzzling, because after all, in the art gallery the light is really rather low in order not to damage the surface of the paintings. So you can't actually take a very good photograph, and particularly in the Golden Age gallery, there are much, much better reproductions to be had in various catalogues or other art books. So it's curious, why should they take the photograph? But of course, it's obvious when you think about it for a moment, and this connects with something that Colin said yesterday about the urge to be in front of the authentic object. You have to remember that all of these people are, of course, tourists, and they're submitting to the prescriptions that you find in all of the guides. They have to go and look at the important aspects of the place that they're visiting. And, it wouldn't do for them, I take it, if they got their friend to take the photograph with the iPhone. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the detail in the image is. What's important is that the perspective from which the photograph was taken is that of the tourists, and so it's a proof that they've ticked that eminent object off on their list. So that's one way in which photography might be prior to art, because of course you're not really interested at all in what you photograph, but that's not what I want to talk about today. Okay, so what do I mean by the priority of photography? Well, here's a really naive thought. We go back around about 30,000 years, and we have, just as being mentioned this morning, these marvelous line renditions of horses. So we have line drawing depictions as well as figures for a good 30,000 years of human existence. Well, when we look for photography, we're at the turn of the 19th century. This is Robert Cornelius, one of the first daguerreotypes that's still in existence, and so this is rather a long time after line drawings. So you might think, in what sense could photography be prior in our understanding of depiction if it comes so late in the day? Now, maybe early 19th century is the wrong date. If you're a believer in some of the Apocrypha, you'll point out that, of course, St. Veronica took an image of the body of Christ as taken down from the cross. So maybe 2,000 years before, but still that's not the 30,000 years into our past. Okay, so that's seemingly naive puzzle, that how could photography be prior in our understanding of depiction if photography technologically comes so late in our history? Well, this is the priority I want to suggest, and we can discuss about. Yeah, it's not Monica that I want to discuss. You're just supposed to relax in her image. So this is the priority I want to suggest, to articulate what's distinctive in our experience of depictions, we need to appeal to the concept, the idea of a natural image. And so that we can understand depiction more generally in terms of our abilities to engage with objects as if they were natural images. Okay, so line drawings and so on, sort of hand-drawn images, I think as many philosophers and art theorists have emphasized, involves an element of pretense or make-believe, but many have focused on the idea that what you must make-believe or pretend is that you're confronted with the object that's depicted, and so that is what it is as if you're perceiving. And what I want to suggest is that, in fact, at least at the first level, the make-believe that would come in viewing a hand-drawn picture is that you're make-believing or imagining you're confronting a natural image, of which one such instance is a photograph, such as of Monica Vitti here. Okay, so what I want to do first is set up a certain kind of problem in some of the philosophical discussion about depiction. And in a way, this intersects a bit with the discussion this morning from Martin and Marina, and their talk of the sense in which, when looking at a picture, one's engaged in some kind of illusion. And a philosophical questioner from the floor was questioning to what extent illusion was involved, and that's in fact traditional in the philosophical debate. So I'll be looking at, I'll first introduce particular ways in which philosophers have tried to do justice to the idea that in some sense Monica is in our experience when we're looking at this, but resist describing it in terms of illusion. And there's a problem about that. And what I'll eventually move on to suggest is, by thinking of a rather unusual example of an image, we'll see how the idea of natural images gives us the resources to answer that puzzle. Okay, so as I said, how I want us to think of our experience of depictions is seeing the idea of a natural image as having a certain kind of priority in our understanding of what's going on in our perception of the world. But that kind of reverses an order which, for example, Richard Wollheim pressed, and which many other philosophers discussing what's distinctive of pictorial representation have accepted. So there's an Aaron Siskin, 1948, which Wollheim uses in his first discussion of seeing in to try and illustrate what he takes the fundamental basis of our ability to experience things as depictions. Okay, so this is a photograph by Siskin of various markings on a wall, and Wollheim suggests that nonetheless you can make sense of this pattern, you can see in it the back of a naked boy. Okay, that's not impossible for you to do. There's various other examples, such as staring at the clouds, how like a whale, and so on. So the suggestion is that you can take just natural configurations that you find in the environment around you, and in some ways see in them or react to them as if you're being presented with the profile of some three-dimensional object. And so it's tempting, and many philosophers have suggested that kind of understanding this kind of response is basic to understanding imagery in general. And so the distinctive contrast between this and, say, this Pompeii wall painting is just that this is an artifact whose intention is to specify for you the kind of game of seeing in that you can just freely do with the system. And then under this way of thinking, then photography will at best just be a special case of this kind of artifact, but there's nothing prior or distinctive about the case of photography. Okay, and so what I want to suggest to you is, in fact, we need to work the other way round. And so, whereas there is something important in the idea of seeing in, which is indeed much more general than you get with images, there's something distinctive about the status of images which is first revealed in relation to photographs and other natural images. Okay, so to see the point of going that way, let's reflect on how Richard Wollheim tried to capture the idea that there's a distinctive experiential aspect to our encounter with depictions. And this is a late statement of his, published in the year that unfortunately he died, where he expresses his idea, two ideas together, that our experience of visual images involves his notion of seeing in, and that what's distinctive in depictions is that we have a certain kind of experience that he calls twofoldness. Interestingly, this is the picture that he's discussing in this paper, but it's not the picture that's reproduced in the volume that the paper comes in. So it's kind of puzzling when you're reading the text and you're looking at the Manet they have displayed, and you're like, it's not Manet Memli, it's Manet de Manet. Anyway, so this is what Wollheim says. When we look at a picture, by which I mean a representational picture, we see something in it. When I look at the Manet, my perception is twofold, in that I simultaneously am visually aware of the marked surface and experience something in front of or behind something else. In this case, a woman in a hat standing in front of a clump of trees. These are two aspects of a single experience. If we use the term seeing in to identify the appropriate perceptual mode to adopt towards representational pictures, when we view them as representational pictures, then my further claim is that twofoldness is an essential feature of seeing in. So he thinks. To see this as a depiction, you've both got to engage in a certain kind of visual imagination which you can engage in with the marks on the wall, as in the Siskin photograph. But you also need to be aware of the surface against which you're engaged in that visual play, for it to be seeing in. Now, what's distinctive of seeing in for Wollheim, which kind of makes it central in understanding the aesthetic value of pictures, is that you can see something in an object without thereby necessarily seeing the object. And I think that's true of some of our talk. Seeing in is hyphenated. It's the technical term that Wollheim wants to introduce to try and explain the kind of experience he supposes we have looking at paintings. Because we have see no hyphen in as a locative that we happily use, and in some cases, if you see something in something, then you see it. So if you see yourself in a mirror, then you see yourself. If you see the cat in the mirror, you see the cat. Okay, but if you see Tony's father in Tony's face, then typically we don't count you as seeing Tony's father. You see Tony, but not Tony's father. So sometimes the in locative requires that you see the object, and sometimes it suggests that you're not seeing the object. So Wollheim's technical use, the special hyphen, does for us the following thing, that you're not seeing the object, or even seeming to see the object. He wants to deny, in contrast to what was suggested this morning, that we should classify our experiences of pictorial representations as a kind of illusion. He wants a way of trying to characterize the experience without having to label it as something which is liable to lead you to a mistaken belief, or that you would have to resist the belief in the face of the picture. Okay, so the hyphen is supposed to give you the idea that this takes the connotation of one of the seeing in locutions, namely that you're not seeing the object, but has an aspect with the other locution when you see in a mirror, that nonetheless we haven't adequately captured your experience if we don't mention the object that you see hyphen in the painting. Okay, so that's the distinctive aspect of seeing in. Okay, but so according to Wollheim then, there are at least two different modes in which you can visually experience an object. I mean, there may be more, but there are at least two. You can see an object, and that elicit conscious experience of it, or you can see some picture of it, and in engaging it in the right mode, see the object in the picture. And that's just going to be another way of experiencing the object. Okay, but the other aspect of his view that's important is that, and again this is to try and resist the idea that there may be something illusory about our experience of paintings, Volheim claims that it's important that you do see the surface of a picture as a surface. Okay, so he thinks that in the case of a trompe-l'oeil, such as this one which he reproduces in that late paper by Le Bond, the difficulties, of course, as fine as these 17th century trompe-l'oeils are, they're not perfect trompe-l'oeils. So you had to imagine that it was in fact in some way a perfect trompe-l'oeil, and he supposes in that case if you're not aware of its surface, then you really do not see an image at all. So for Volheim, it follows that the only way in which you can see something as an image is by seeing surface properties of it, which are properties of the surface of the representing, not what's represented. Okay, and what I'm going to go on to do is suggest that we at least have the idea of certain visual representations for which that doesn't hold. Okay, so Volheim's picture of what's distinctive of pictorial representation, I think, is not broad enough, it's not general enough. Or rather, of visual representation, because the images I'll talk about are not pictures. Now, lots of philosophers after Volheim have been very concerned with certain aspects of his view, and in fact, among philosophers at least, it's fallen somewhat out of favour. So, one worry is that if it's the experience that one enjoys when one looks at an object that makes it a representation, but that experience is not itself a seeing, it's not a perceiving of the object, or a seeming to perceive, because that's the way Volheim accepts the intuitive thought that when you look at the Manet portrait of Madame Brunet, you don't count as seeing her. And he wants to reject the illusory picture, so it's not that you seem to see her in a sense that you're under the illusion that you're seeing her. So it's just that you're having an experience, but this is a kind of experience that isn't a seeing. Then what is it about the object that you do see that makes it count as a depiction? So if we just think of the experience as something that's caused by the object, then in what sense do you have to count as seeing the object? And the most vivid example of that I can think of is that of that worry is Flint Shear. Once put forward a view as a variant on Volheim's, in which he wanted to say, well, how you have to think of pictures, what's special about pictures, is pictures do for you what the objects themselves can do for you. So if you'd met Marilyn Monroe, and you'd paid attention, then you'd have been able to recognize her in the street. Okay? But you can recognize Marilyn Monroe just from having looked at a photograph of Marilyn Monroe. It's just so. Shear hoped to suggest that by looking at the kinds of recognitional capacities that you could acquire from depictions, we could understand what was distinctive of depictions. But as his thesis examiners pointed out, and as he added a chapter when he published the book, this is subject to an obvious problem. Suppose that there was a blank canvas, as far as you were concerned. When you looked at it, you described it as a blank canvas. But when you walked away, and luckily bumped into Marilyn Monroe in the street, you said, Marilyn! You're wearing exactly the same dress, and so on. Okay, so if we think of the experience as just caused by the object, without specifying that you have to perceive it, then we haven't really captured the idea that we see the pictures as representations. Okay, so we mean not only the idea that there's a distinctive experience of what's depicted, but we need to understand how that comes into seeing the depiction as the representation it is. And if one need not see the object in seeing the image of it, which of course Volheim wants to claim in avoiding the illusory model of depiction, that's the question, in what sense can the object figure in your experience at all? And that's in fact in a way, the most standard philosophical objection. So there's a late exchange between Robert Hopkins and Richard Wollheim in the Aristotelian Society, in which Hopkins objects to Wollheim's model that surely your experience is either of the depicted object, in which case it would be an illusion, or it's of something else, in which case it's not an experience of the object. Okay, so people want to know more about what seeing an object in something should be, that it has to involve the object. And it looks like all that Wollheim does is he just labels this kind of experience, he's not explaining it. And so, for that kind of reason, it turns out that these days among philosophers, it's kind of more popular not to appeal to Wollheim's notion of seeing in, although people still like to use the label. But they suppose that somehow what's special about objects is somehow you can see a resemblance between an image and what it's an image of. What I'll suggest is that's an inadequate account of what's distinctive of images. But the way to get there, I think, is to leave aside the two-dimensional entirely. That's what we've been focusing on, and those, in fact, making the three-dimensional appear two-dimensional is at the heart of the tricks that Patrick's been playing on us. But I want to push back to suggest that we can actually think of images in 3 dimensions and not just 2 dimensions. And some of the important experience of something as an image can occur in 3 dimensions. Okay, so for most of the philosophical discussions of depiction, the focus is on the interesting thing that in being confronted with a 2-dimensional stimulus, we can't help but try and interpret it in 3 dimensions. And so thinking that's the heart of what we're interested in the idea of an image. What I want to suggest is if we move to 3 dimensions, we can still see the idea of imagery playing a role, but the interpretation of 2 dimensions into 3 dimensions is no longer at play. So that great philosopher George Lucas is going to come to our hand. This is Star Wars Episode 4, the very first one, 1977. I have to click on it.
Oh, he says it's nothing, sir. Merely a malfunction. Oh, dear.
Well, you can get it smashed. Because it's going to be redone as a 3D version soon. Okay, I take it in this case, as part of the fiction when you watched it in 1977, or again when it was released in 1992, you're invited to see this as an image of Princess Leia. Okay, and moreover in the story you see it as being 3-dimensional. I mean, obviously you just have a 2-dimensional array through which to see it, but so you see it as a kind of holographic photograph of a particular individual. You have no difficulty immediately understanding the scene in that way. It's not that it's puzzling for you that there's a sudden play of light. Rather, you immediately, even in 1977, when people didn't have mobile phones or anything, they immediately saw it as Lucas intended it, and they played with the image in order to get that kind of effect. Now, when I first started thinking about these things and thought about this case, I hadn't realized quite how much of a cultural meme the Princess Leia hologram is. But it's such an obsession that, for instance, a recent MIT lab that's working on live holographic transmission uses Princess Leia as the figure that has to be presented. So, you know, I was a rather unimpressed late teenager when this first came out, but clearly the generation afterwards, it's really important. Well, obsessions with holograms carry on in Hollywood movies, but they don't always work this way. So here's an example to briefly show you the great acting skills of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, amazing. Arnold Schwarzenegger manages both to act the role of Quaid and the role of Quaid's hologram. So this really shows the range of his actual skills. It's quite amazing. But I take it, the whole point in that display is that that's a hologram which is supposed to look solid. And I think that contrasts with the Princess Leia case, so there's no sense of that solidity. And so in general, what I think is the Princess Leia hologram gives us the sense of how, even were there something in 3 dimensions, we would see it as an image. Okay? Which is not to say that we see all holograms as images. That was partly the point of showing you the total recall. But if I wanted to gross you out, I'd make us all go to Fribourg, and we could go and see the Geiger Museum, which is full of tacky green holograms of the alien monster in all of its various forms. And the holograms in their nature, I mean, there's old laser. Holograms don't have a proper surface. They're a little bit shiny, but they do look solid. It just looks like there's a solid green ugly thing behind the glass. Okay, so many holograms look to be solid, but I think it's important that in the Princess Leia case, that's not how we see it, and we see it as an image. So I think we see the Leia hologram as an image of the princess, or of Carrie Fisher, if you prefer it. Let's stay within the fiction. It's Princess Leia. And so we don't see it, for example, as a mannequin or another copy. Okay, and I think what's interesting about the current fad for 3-dimensional cinema is one of the disappointing aspects of it can be, particularly if you don't have an IMAX cinema, is that you kind of get that flip back and forth between whether it's still an image or whether it's just little mannequins running around. So for instance, it was very popular, but I thought it was rather nuggetry, the Joss Whedon Avengers, when you have Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk swinging around, sometimes it just looks like there's a little mini model that you could have gone and bought of Mark Ruffalo in green spinning around. That's kind of not really exciting. You need it to be an image for it to have the impact that you want. Okay, but at least in the Princess Leia case, we see it, I think, as an image. It's not a copy. And notice that, obviously in this case, we have a quite good resemblance of Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, but presumably there was an artist who made this image. But we could imagine that, in fact, the Lego factory entirely automated the process and didn't have an artist involved, so that, we'd have to go back to 1977 and use the time machine. They invite Carrie Fisher to Scandinavia, and they get her to stand in a suitable vat, which then creates a mold around her. And out of that, they then get plastic injection mold that makes a perfect copy of Princess Leia. Okay, so in that case, you'd have a reproductive process that would get you something of the form of Carrie Fisher. That's just even in that case, confronting us as like as can be as the earlier image. You don't see it as an image of her. You immediately see it as a figurine. Is it an action figure or is it a doll? That's the really important question. But you see it as likely an artifact to be used in games, but you don't see it as a representation, I suggest, in the way that we can see the Princess Leia image. So I think that's an interesting question. What is it about, is there something that we can articulate about the way we see the Princess Leia image that makes us think of it as image-like or intrinsically representational in a way that we don't see a mannequin or a statue or a copy as being so? Notice, by the way, this is the key thing about why I think visual, once we move to 3 dimensions, it seems to me that it's obvious that appealing to the idea of visually experienced resemblance couldn't key us into the idea of a representation. Because, of course, the mannequin or the Lego model is equally, in fact, more visually resembling of Leia than is the image. And this is one important aspect that I'll come back to. Not least because the mannequin looks solid in a way in which the image fails to. Okay, so the copy would actually be more visually resembling than the image, but that doesn't kick us into thinking that it's a representation. It may just kick us into thinking there's a doppelganger. Okay, well, what I think may be going on here is thinking about a possibility that occurs in relation to visual phenomena and the visual world, where we don't have the same options in relation to other commonsensically conceived sense modalities. and in particular how we think of appearance in relation to vision, and the ways things look, versus the way things sound, or smell, or they taste. So what I would suggest is that light or colour, I should have used more than that. I'll turn it back. Yes. Light or colour does not stand to sight as sound or smell stand to audition or olfaction. I want to suggest. In particular, visible objects do have visual appearances. Okay, that's what we characterize when we're talking about the look of something. But when we talk about the smell or the taste of something, or if you prefer the flavour of something in that synesthetic sense, then we're inclined to think that there's a distinct sensible object that you can attend to, for which the object is responsible, and which you might think of somewhat, as I speak, potential competition for your attention. So, very famously, Berkeley in the dialogues, when Berkeley is trying to convince you that seeing of objects is indirect, he starts with the example of hearing the coach, hearing the sound that the coach makes. And I think it is natural for us to think that we typically hear things through hearing the sounds that they make. And the cases where we're most liable just to say simply that we heard someone is where we can also see them, and see them producing the sound, so you get kind of synesthetic thing. But otherwise, people are inclined to say, well, you hear events and objects through hearing the sounds that they produce. But unless you're a certain kind of philosopher who believes in a certain kind of sense data, you're unlikely to say of the visual case that you see objects by seeing distinct visibilia, sense data, or whatever. Rather, a kind of picture of the visual world is that we see concrete objects themselves. We see things like my garish bag or the table. So, ordinary concrete objects are among the visibilia. They have appearances, but so their appearances aren't distinct from them, but an aspect of them. They're the dimensions in which objects are visibly similar or different from each other. Colour, shape, texture, size, and in an important way I'll mention in a moment, solidity for concrete objects. So these are, to a large extent, the solidity is the exception, what philosophers have often called the observational aspects of objects, so those in which they can be visibly similar or different. Okay, but the other important thing I think in the visual case, which comes with allowing that concrete objects are among the things that we just see, is that in the visual world we have a contrast between the concrete objects we see and what we might call mere visibilia, things that we think of that have an existence as aspects of the visual world, but we don't expect to have any other existence beyond that. So you might think of shadows, highlights, rainbows, and of course holograms in this way. So we don't expect that they have features that we could detect, for instance, by touch or otherwise causally encounter. So one way we could talk of this, and moreover, the point that I want to make is not only that we think of the visual world as containing ordinary objects and mere light objects, but that this contrast between them is visually marked for us. So David Katz, in his book, The World of Colour, points out that there are kind of three ways in which we experience colour. We have coloured light, we have surface colour, and we have film colour. I think some film colours and coloured light belong on the side of mere visibilia. Some film colours and surface colour are indicating to us the seeming presence of concrete objects. Okay, so we have concrete objects and mere light objects, and the contrast between them somehow marked for us visually. One other thing I wanted to say. And so one way you could misleadingly put that, which connects with how Locke tries to draw the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, you could say what concrete objects present to us in the visual world is that they're solid. That's slightly misleading because clouds belong on the concrete side, but we don't typically think of clouds as solid. But nonetheless, the idea that these entities have a nature beyond what we detect purely visually. That's important. Okay, so I think it's that which is playing into the idea, both that although a visual appearance of an object is not distinct from it, we can nonetheless talk of the visual appearance of an object as if it's an entity which belongs to it. And with that, the possibility of seeing certain things in the world as images. And, oh, sorry, bad effect. So I think that we can separate, at least in idea, the appearance of an object from that object itself precisely through images. And so the example of the Princess Leia hologram is, if you like, the purest kind of case of imagery that we can imagine. So the hologram of Leia reproduces her appearance, form and colour, but obviously as it was set up, not size. We've got her shrunk down, but no doubt George Lucas tried it out with full-size Carrie Fisher. But again, who's to say Carrie Fisher isn't really that compact? And to some extent, but not entirely, we can come back to that, texture. Okay, effects of making it purely light is you don't get micro shadowing, so you don't get full texture on these objects. So, nonetheless, we see the hologram. There are various clues in the scene as a mere visibile. We think there's a light entity here. Okay, we don't see it as a solid object. In Arnold's great acting case, Arnold manages to convince you that he's his own hologram. And that's brilliantly manages to put it on. But in that case, the hologram appears solid. I don't quite know how they did the micro shadowing. I think you'd have to ask Paul Verhoeven that would be for another day. But in this case, that's not that. It's transparently not a solid object. But in as much as you see it as reproducing the appearance of a solid object, then the thing that you see doesn't exemplify the appearance that's reproduced, that's presented before you. Okay, because that's the appearance of a solid being. That's the appearance of Princess Leia. But Princess Leia isn't there. Most there's a ghost. So now, if we do see it as the reproduction of her appearance, then the question for us is, well, since that solid object isn't there, which object is it, which isn't present, whose appearance has been reproduced for me? So I think the idea of images kind of gives us this core notion of representation that we get in the phenomenological tradition of presence in absence. So that you can preserve the appearance of a solid object while not being manifestly solid gives you the idea of how you can reproduce the appearance of something without having to have reproduced that object. Whereas when we go back to the Princess Leia mannequin, Carrie Fisher's been dipped in the tank and then we have the plastic mold injection. You've got a better copy of her, but the cost of having the copy is you have another solid object over again. Okay, so the idea of the pure image in the Princess Leia hologram is you've got something as close to a solid object without being so. And it's manifestly not solid, but still it has the appearance of the solid object. And that's what keys you into this idea that it may be a representation, or so I claim. Okay, so here's one way of contrasting it. Sorry, we're going a bit higher. Doria Pamphili, if you go into the back room on the main floor, you'll see the Velázquez Pope Innocent X next to the Bernini sculpture of it. Now, obviously, what I want to compare is the three-dimensional hologram of Innocent X, but for some reason, the Vatican never got around to commissioning one. So we have to pretend for the moment that Velázquez made images in a different way than he did. But notice that on the right-hand side with the Bernini, you really do, Bernini's genius is you do get a sense of the wispy beard, just as Velázquez manages to get it for you on the left-hand side. But in giving the appearance of the wispy beard, still we've got something which is manifestly solid for us there. And so there's the solid thing which has its attributes, albeit because we're used to using statuary in a kind of pretense make-believe, it manages to suggest something more to us. Bernini manages to suggest the wispiness despite the dogged solidity of the marble. But what I want to suggest, the 3D image goes one better, because the 3D image is manifestly a visual object. There's nothing to the image in itself beyond the appearance that it represents in that case. That's to say that the form that we see and the colours that we see are the ones that we attribute to the represented object. Okay, so if that's right, then the Princess Leia hologram, or at least would be if it were actually, as it's not at the moment technically possible, would give us an example of an image in which there was no second fold of Wollheim's two-foldedness of the experience of images. Because there'd be no surface that wasn't the depicted surface for you to experience. So Wollheim sees what's distinctive of seeing something as a representation in terms of there being something extra that you see that is not represented, but the vehicle of representation. I want to say, I don't want to deny that that may be true of many representations, but I think the Princess Leia case gives us an example in which it goes the reverse way around. It's the subtraction here which keys us into representation, not the addition. It's the subtraction of solidity, while we still have the holistic conviction that this is the appearance of a solid object, which keys us into the idea that it's an image. And so the most fundamental notion here is, as I said before, presence in absence, rather than addition of vehicle. Okay, not much there. So, just very generally, okay, I've been talking about three-dimensional holograms, but they're so rare that we only find them in George Lucas fictions and fan fiction about it. And clearly we're interested more generally in depictions. So how does this generalize to the two-dimensional case? Well, one way of asking that is, what's the difference between a photocopy and a photograph? Because there's a photocopy on the whole, I mean, particularly when it is a photocopy. I don't know where I got this from, because it's a Foreign and Commonwealth Office letter about international relations at some point. Took an image of it. When, on the whole, a well-produced photocopy, say various handouts, I mean, these days I never photocopy handouts, I just send them to the laser printer and it does them, but you know, some of my colleagues still put a sheet on top of the camera element of the printer, and then they get these copies of an original that they had. It's incredibly difficult, if it's been high quality photocopier and the paper's been laid correctly, to see it as an image. It is an image, but you don't see it as an image. You see it as a copy of the original thing. You know, if you put a book down, and so you've got the pages going back, then you get a certain sense of image then, but then you've also got a depictive element. When you've got a completely flat original, and you make another copy of it, it just looks like a copy. You can't really see it as an image. Whereas, that doesn't look like a copy of Monica Vitti to me. And clearly, it's a copy of, well, the digitization of a positive of what was originally a negative taken in 1960, I suppose, or 1961. But it's really difficult to see it as the copy of an earlier physical thing, although clearly it is. We just see through it to the photographic image. Okay, so why are some of these photographs, the photocopies, just seen as copies, and others are immediately seen as images? Well, I want to suggest that really we should just generalize what we've been saying, and it's at this point that our concern with how we see the three-dimensional in two-dimensional really belongs. And so much of the work that Wollheim wants seeing in to do as well. So it seems to me that the photocopy exemplifies the properties which it gives the appearance of. It becomes perceptible as an image only when we get aspects in the image which the flat sheet doesn't exemplify. Okay, so, but on the whole, photographs, obviously not all photographs, since photocopies are typically photographs. Photograph presents an appearance it doesn't exemplify. So a two-dimensional array can offer only a limited profile of the visual appearance of the scene, and as Thomas was pointing out this morning, there are various ways in which it fails to capture what you would get from the scene. And that limitation is in various ways manifest to the viewer. So we could say if photographs exemplify a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional appearance, and manifestly do that. So in that way you would say that the photograph of Monica Vitti depicts her, and the image intrinsically is of her. Okay, in the photograph case, we're prompted with the same question as we are with the Princess Leia hologram. Here I have the appearance of something which isn't in front of me. What is it the appearance of? And so it represents that which is the correct answer to that question. That's the picture I suggest we have. So the photographic print doesn't possess the visual appearance of Monica Vitti. It has none of her virtues in that way. It just reproduces them, conveys them to us. Okay, and so just to sum up, sorry, I've been going on so long. That's just a sketch of Richard Volheim again. An image presents an appearance which it does not exemplify, I want to suggest. I think that's the key mark of an image. Now, unlike Volheim, we can then admit the perfectly natural classification that trompe-l'oeil, and for that matter Arnold Schwarzenegger holograms, are images. So an illusory image is one which seems to exemplify the appearance, I say possesses, it should be, which it presents, which it reproduces. Okay, even though it doesn't exemplify it. Okay, that doesn't stop it being an image, because what will be key for an image is just that an appearance has been reproduced, which isn't exemplified. Now, an image that can be perceived as an image presents the appearance of an object without seeming to exemplify that appearance. That, I think, is the core of the idea of a depiction. And once we have that, the reason that I suggested, the image can be seen as representing the object which does exemplify that appearance. Okay, because it raises the question, if we think of the appearance in question as one as having been reproduced in some way, so being brought about that you're confronting this appearance, then we have the question, but which appearance was it that was so reproduced? Okay, so that's what I suggest that we have with the idea of a natural image. So the notion of a natural image is much narrower than the notion that philosophers and art theorists have typically used in this area. Philosophers and art theorists have typically appealed to what Paul Grice happily called natural meaning, where he suggested that if something is a certain way because something else was a certain way, then it naturally means that that thing was that way. And so often when art theorists appealing to Persis suggest, well, the thing about photographs in contrast to hand-drawn pictures is that they're somehow indexical. They often appeal to that notion of natural meaning. It's just that notion of natural meaning is just far too general. There are just many, many things which naturally mean, and even are artifactually used to exploit their natural meaning, which we don't see as images. Okay, so I don't think that captures what is distinctive about seeing something as an image. So I think what's distinctive about seeing something as an image is precisely this idea that an appearance has been reproduced without being exemplified. That's what we've got in the Princess Leia hologram. Okay, so if that's the fundamental idea about what it is to experience something as a representation, then we might suggest how we're to understand what's in common across visual representations, which we see as naturalistic pictures, is we're able to see them as being approximations to photographs, or rather more generally, approximations to natural images, of which photographs are the technological realizations that we've managed to have. Okay, so what you do when you confront a hand-drawn picture, as this of Richard Volheim, is to the extent that you see it as a naturalistic depiction, you imagine it as presenting the appearance that Richard presented on the occasion that the sketch was made. So again, rather than thinking of pictures as inviting you to imagine seeing the person, although that may to some extent be involved, that can be a further part of the representation. The first level of seeing something as a distinctive pictorial representation is seeing it as if it were a photograph. And that's what gives us the priority of photographs, even if they come 28,000 or 29, 29, forget the scroll. Even if they come rather late on the stage. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Some of the things you seem to be grappling with about visual appearance seem to be related to a literature in computer graphics where they try to have the possibility of separating the material properties of the surface from the shape that is depicted. And there is actually a set of procedures for altering, for example, the appearance of a specularity on the surface, or changing its shininess, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that does fit in with some of the things you're trying to grapple with here about the difference between the line drawing and the photo. The photo is presenting something about the materiality of the objects as well as the outline appearance and the shape and so on and so forth. That's only partially true, because obviously the line drawings are presenting some of that as well. So I wondered if you thought about separating. There are different judgments that you make about images, and you seem to be focusing on a single presentation, a sort of canonical natural image, whereas in fact a lot of the time we're actually making different judgments about these images that are presented to us.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. So here's the context in which that issue arises that you were pressing about whether images versus line drawings are presenting things like specular detail. Undoubtedly, hand-drawn images can give you more or less detail, but actually, the same I think is true of photographs. But you can have hand-drawn pictures which look just like a photograph. Although it looks just like a photograph, it's not a photographic image. So the question is, do we explain what it is for it to be seen as a depiction in terms of explaining what it is for something to be seen as a photograph? Or do we use a more general category of what it is to see something as a depiction? Okay, so what I was trying to suggest is actually photographs are special in understanding how we see something as a depiction, because the limit case of a three-dimensional image is something which we can just subtract things from the visual array to get it to the point that we see it as an image. So it's a mistake for philosophers and art theorists to have thought what it takes to see something as an image is for it to have a positive additional element, that you see it as two-dimensional, for example, or that you see it as having a certain surface texture. I want to say that that's inessential. If that's inessential, then there's a question, what is it about depictions that makes us think of them as depictions? And that's where I was appealing to the idea of visual appearance, to try and explain that. So the idea that we think in encountering an image that we've taken in the appearance of something, but we're really fully aware that the thing whose appearance we've taken in is not what we're perceptually confronting.
Yes, but I mean, to follow up with your example of the Princess Leia has been made into the Lego figure, and compare that with a real photograph of Carrie dressed up and so on, what is it that you're pointing us to there? They're both Princess Leia, and
Good. But,
So
I think
to me, it's the surface appearance of dress, form, plastic, and so on.
yes, but so what I was suggesting was a key difference. This is what I brought in discussing the Bernini, is that with the mannequin, you see it as a solid object. So you see it as exemplifying the surface colours and textures and form which are immediately presented to you. Although it's also, because it's an artifact which has a representational function, you see it as an action figure or a doll to play with in your favourite Star Wars game when you get home. Okay, so there's a further representational function which you can immediately recognise that it has. But that, I think, is not distinctively visual. Whereas I think we recognise standard photographs as in themselves a certain special kind of visual representation. What I was suggesting is that's how we classify the Princess Leia hologram as well. So the question is, what's the additional feature which makes us classify the Princess Leia hologram in that way that we wouldn't characterise a wax effigy of Carrie Fisher at Madame Tussauds? We just wouldn't think, oh, that's intrinsically a representation of that. No, that's one of their crap sculptors doing whatever they do to make you think. Sorry.
Trying to fit everyone. Nico.
So I have no doubts about your take on the Avengers, but I do have a doubt about your take on depiction here.
Right.
So I was concerned that it might predict that we have cases of depiction where we don't have cases of depiction.
Okay.
And one kind of example I'm wondering about is the sort of accidentally produced perfect duplicate of a depiction. You know, so where, the thing looks just like the Mona Lisa or what have you, but where I would want to say it's not a depiction of anything. It's just this randomly produced.
Okay, good.
But it produces the experience, that the Mona Lisa would
Okay,
produce.
good.
And then there's another case, but maybe just for...
Well, let's just start with that.
Yeah.
I think what you need to focus on is a case of photography rather than depiction in general.
Sure.
Because I didn't fully specify how the make-believe would come in, but I'd actually make exactly the move that Volheim makes about the artifactual purpose of depictions. So hand-drawn depictions are artifacts which are intended for their audience to engage in the make-believe response that they are photographs. So the accidentally produced parallel to the Mona Lisa lacks that artifactual status. Okay, but what I was suggesting of photographs is that photographs are artifacts which embed or capture natural images. Okay, so suppose we've got a haphazardly produced, accidentally produced copy of a photograph. What will I say about that? Well, that depends on how it's produced. So copy is ambiguous in English. There are two senses of copy. One is something is a copy of another if it's just indistinguishable from it. It has all the same intrinsic qualities. A copy in that sense of a photograph does not count as an image in my sense, because just that it's indiscriminable from the reproduction in appearance doesn't show that it's a reproduction. Okay, so the other sense of copy which we use in the photocopy case is a copy is something which has been in some way causally reproduced from the original. Okay, so if you've got a naturally produced copy of a photograph that somehow the heavens have so operated that somehow, say you've left the photograph in the drawer and some strange mix of chemicals have poured through the drawer, poured through the photograph, and now reproduced the pattern of light and shade on a sensitive piece of paper underneath it, then I would count that as an instance of the original photographic image. But we've managed to find a way of copying. So I don't think those cases are in fact.
So I'll think of just one more case to throw out there. So if my friend, cleverly disguises himself as Obama and, in some sense, duplicates the appearance of Obama, I might take a picture of him. But there, I wouldn't want to say that I have a photograph of Obama. I'm also uncomfortable saying that I even have a depiction of Obama there. But your account seems to predict that we would.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's not a photographic image of Obama. But again, what I was suggesting doesn't predict that. What's required is a photographic image, is an image of the entity whose appearance has been reproduced. But I don't reproduce Obama's appearance. I can mimic his appearance, but I don't reproduce in the relevant sense by putting on boot polish and whatever I would do in order to appear to be a Chicago lawyer. So...
Wait, why aren't you presenting the appearance of Obama when you perfectly disguise yourself as Obama? Okay. I thought that's essential to the success of the perfect disguise there.
No, I think you're... So I think in that case, so I didn't define the relevant notion of present for you, it's true. What I want to suggest is there are underlying potential causal processes, just as there can be when you reproduce a copy of an object. There could be a process which what it does is reproduces its appearance, but now without exemplifying it. Okay, so to make an appearance which is similar to the original is not thereby to reproduce it in the relevant sense. Okay, that's the contrast between, in effect, two notions of copy. But it's true that I haven't specified for you the relevant processes of reproduction which are allowed and which are not. Indeed, I don't think we can define them in advance any more than any of the other processes where we suppose there are distinctive processes for reproduction. For example, what makes it that a given collection of words counts as a copy of Ulysses? There's been a process of reproduction that traces back to the original manuscripts and the original versions of the printer that James Joyce produced. But I don't think we have a way of defining what the processes of reproduction are to say when something is a copy. I think a similar kind of unclarity will go on in the case of the kinds of processes which are required for something to count as a reproduction.
Okay, I have many people waiting, so you can keep the exchanges shorter on both sides. Martin, and then the...
First, a historical footnote, and this is to almost everybody who discusses photographs. Photography, the invention of, is an extension of at least 4 centuries of trying to get objective aspects of images. And the fact that photography is invented is predicated upon the fact it's a desirable thing to do. So, but my main point is more a philosophical one, and that is, can we rescue anything from Richard's seeing in? And I think we can if we remove it from being a universal explanation. But if we take something like a Vermeer or Titian, there's a hell of a lot of seeing in that we do. And I would say being aware it's a painting, i.e. on a surface, without necessarily perceiving the surface or emphasizing it or being very aware of it is that. And the problem that Richard has was then transferring this key aspect of what we do with paintings into a universal explanation of representation. And if we can use it in a more local sense, it's still a very potent text.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, although I used him as the stalking horse to press, he's much closer to what we want than most of the current philosophical theories, because the current philosophical theories that appeal to this idea of visually experienced resemblance are just too broad, and they're mainly based in a denial of something that I thought Richard saw very clearly, that we experience the object depicted when we look at a depiction. That's part of our experience. You haven't described our experience properly if you leave that out of the story. And that was central to what he wanted to say about pictures. And I think he was absolutely right about it.
Could I just invite you, Mike, in a similar way to, I'll try to do this really quickly, but to expand this in no way, I don't think in any way, it actually prejudices what you said, but to expand it in a certain way on the notion of having takes. And I'm going to address 3 things within the phenomenological tradition, and particularly with regard to film and comparison with other fictive or other. so when it's on, Coleridge talks about the willing suspension of disbelief. And when I go to this, I don't have to will it at all. In one sense, I do. I'm really emotionally affected by certain things that I, at the same time, know. I see Lear, now, within the German aesthetic tradition, certainly, from the end of the 18th century, they were interested in notions of irony, which is about those two parallel. That sort of aim, almost a sort of cavell, something. But Sartre, really interesting, Sartre, when he started emotion, he talked about the notion of taking something seriously. What he means, as opposed to people use photographs to do emotion research, you're confronted a real tiger, it actually comes to you, I'm afraid you take that seriously in a way that you simply don't when you do those kinds of psychology. Now, what I want to raise is, when I watch films, and by the way, of course, seeing Monica Vitti there reminds me of my teenage days.
That's not keeping up.
No, it's important. It's absolutely crucial. Let me say, films have the capacity to arouse me erotically. Which, when I go to the theatre, there are real three-dimensional things, and I simply can't. Maybe
Maybe you don't go to the right.
oh no!
You're Soho.
No, I've been with a friend of mine in Paris, owns a series of enterprises, and he has taken me to a live show. I have to say, my point is, here's the point. The point is, these different media, for very interesting reasons, I think it's to do with what the lighting, when you really see things in a thematic way, they remove you from the real world essentially. I no longer have an egocentric frame of reference in that case, because the real world isn't there, doesn't impose itself. They enable you or remove or disenable you from taking stances at that time. That's what I'm saying is doesn't prejudice what you're talking about theologians, but in the movie image, I think there's an interesting case of where you're able or not able to take the stances that you refer to. They are stances, whereas in this case they're not.
Okay.
Well,
You're just taking
in effect, it was an observation. So
okay.
I think there's a lot to be said that it's not.
No.
Yes, I can agree. So one thing Wollheim seems to have been thinking is important is that we explain the fact that some of Manet's paintings are paintings of Parisian woman, but no particular Parisian woman, and he stresses this all over the place. So if we, on your model, are asked to treat these handmade pictures as photographs, at least if we have that explanation, these kinds of pictures seem to pose a problem because...
Oh no, absolutely not.
Okay, maybe...
Because I take it the generality that we get there is a generality which is a hallmark of all imagining. So you can imagine an apple without there being any specific apple that you're imagining. So you're being invited to imagine a photograph of a Parisian woman without there being any specific Parisian woman or specific photograph that it is a photograph of.
Right.
So the generality comes in at the first level of the imagining. So in fact we get the parallel explanation of why in depicting can be non-specific, just as we would want.
Okay.
Well, I was going to ask a different question, but I'm going to follow up on Martin's. So I think that your account of our invitation to make believe that we are seeing photographs, it makes sense when we are looking at very realistic paintings. But if we see an image and these icons on toilets, it seems that at least is more difficult to accommodate that to the idea that we are invited by that image to imagine that we're seeing a photograph of a man or a woman. So
yeah, no, I guess there I kind of fundamentally disagree with you. So it's true that when we So one of the questions here is about how appearance is the worldly shadow of how our visual cognition works. And so I naively accept various suggestions that stick figures and the like reflect aspects of our higher visual processing categorizing. And so that means something which engages that aspect of our visual system in response to it is presenting an aspect of the appearance of an object. And so in a parallel way then, when you look at a stick figure, although it's an etiolated case of the imagining, there's an awful lot of work that you have to put into it. Nonetheless, the work is properly visual in the right way. I mean, I think the things with the toilet icons is a kind of intermediate case, because some icons, and certainly the Busapa Itai ones, which made everyone giggle so much, they are towards the stick figure, but others are really just icons, so they have a certain symbolic significance, and you shift between them. But lots of the cases that have supposedly been difficult for resemblance cases ought not to be a problem for this, as long as we allow ourselves to be empirically guided by suitable, appropriate accounts of how visual cognition is working.
Quick, and then Jonah, quick.
Oh, well, not terribly quick, but just following up from that then. That was not a question. I'm thinking of pictures by Picasso, Rouault, Gerald Scarfe, Stedman, caricaturist artists, in which you not only get minimal exemplification, but you get contradictory, stuff on the canvas, more of it, arguably, quite difficult to prove. And yet there's a very powerful sense of presence. You can't really do that in abstract. It would be much better to do it in pictures, but I think you have in mind the kind of thing that I'm talking about. In other words, I think that works better for people often go to naturalistic pictures, but if you go to the history of art, which she's very interested in, and you look at the cave paintings and the way it's built up or whatever, you look at something which seems to have an inbuilt two-foldedness, and sometimes a tension between the two-fold, which is kind of deliberately exploited, and certainly later on.
Long observation is not quick question.
Well, so there's a contradiction. You didn't really answer that. So it's minimal. You'd expect some kind of covariation or something to the exemplification and the image.
No, that's absolutely. All the view requires, its consequence is that whether something is viewable as an image is a holistic matter. Because think of a painting which, as some of the Cézanne paintings, for example, show you the wallpaper fabric in a room. Then that pattern in the painting is not one that you, on its own, isolated, you can see as being presented but not exemplified. The pattern is itself is exemplified in the sub-area. So you see it as depicted in a plane which falls away from where you are, only in the context of the image as a whole. So philosophers, hoping to get some kind of compositional theory of pictorial representation, have often tried to define it in terms of correspondence relations between local areas and build up the overall condition of depiction for a picture as a whole. Whereas, given the kind of account that I'm suggesting, the prediction is you can't do that. That you've actually got holistic constraints. You won't be able to tell of a given area whether it's depicted or not without reference to the larger element in which it's embedded. So it's the reverse of the kind of correlation.
So it seems to me that exemplifying the appearance of something either comes in degrees or it doesn't, and neither seems very happy for your position. So if it doesn't come in degrees, then it's only going to be a perfect solid hologram that exemplifies appearances. A hologram with a few extra wee spots or nicks or something isn't going to, and that's a result I would have thought you wanted to resist, but if exemplifying appearance comes in degrees, which I think is more plausible, then it seems that statues of popes, photographs of Monica Vitae comes in degrees, her hair is black, the photograph is black. Similarly with natural drawings and so on, you might say it has parts that have certain outline shapes and so on.
Okay, good. You're right. Well, if saying exemplifying the appearance is the dilemma you're offering is either it's exactly replicating or it's resembling in some respect. And clearly the important one is resembling in some respect. But then you're noticing, well, aren't there respects and respects? And what was embedded but not made fully articulate in the story I told and came out a little bit in discussion with Andy is with the three-dimensional representations, the key respect is in relation to solidity, as I put it. Okay, so the thought is, if the Princess Leia hologram, in fact, doesn't have good skin tone, you'd be very worried for Carrie Fisher if she looked that way. So it's not perfect along that dimension. But a statue might equally have the bad skin tone, or you might colour it in, and that wouldn't make any difference in either of those cases to think it was or wasn't a depiction. So in the three-dimensional case, what I'm suggesting is the key mark is whether you see it as solid or not. That is it's being able to see that this is the appearance reproduced of a solid object by something which is not solid, is the mark of it. Okay, that's not what's key in the two-dimensional case. There are two-dimensional images which are not solid. I mean, none of these have been solid images. Okay, but, well, it's a play of projected light. It's not, the screen itself is a rather boring pattern for you to look at. But Patrick's painting up on the second floor is clearly a solid depiction. So there, the key shift that's in common between the solid and the mere light 2D images is the shift between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So that you can recognize that what's being presented to you is a 3-dimensional appearance. It's the appearance of something solid. Something with volume. Whereas what you're confronting is something flat.
We'll make an exception.
No, don't make
1 minute.
It's just that I've always been struck by this curious question of unintended mimicry, which actually has a biologically not intended, but a certain unavoidable effect, like Mullerian illusions, for example, or the other way, when you get harmless animals which are not poisonous, acquiring, or in the course of their development, acquire an appearance which represents them to a possible predator as being something which it would be preferable not to eat. And then a whole group of things, of animals which are all poisonous, and they acquire exactly the same appearance to give an impression to all predators that they are in fact not edible, or edible to the predator's disadvantage. I think it's quite hard to think of whether that in fact is anything like a depiction or not.
On my view, the answer is no.
To bring them out.
But that wouldn't stop them being natural images. So you would get natural images, on my view, if there were some organisms which were pure light, but carried the appearance of solid, nasty prey. But since there aren't pure light organisms, so the key thing for depiction, I was suggesting, where you have a solid object which is itself in 3 dimensions, is that it not actually possess the appearance in question.
Well, how about
Whereas that's a case like a fake tomato looking just like a tomato. They both actually share an appearance. They have the same shape, the same colour. That's what's happening with these organs.
But then there's the opposite, is camouflage, in which
Yeah,
there is
absolutely.
actually a pretense not to be there at all.
Yeah, yeah.
In what sense is that a depiction? Is it a depiction of the fact being absent?
I'm sorry we have to stop here, but I'm sure you'll have time to ask Mike more questions. And let's thank Mike for